And so this is a combination. This will be a combination of some of the learning from the Summer Institute in 2023 and the Summer Institute in 2024, okay? And so with that being said, go to the next slide. Some of our outcomes for our shared learning today. Number one is that we're able to identify storylines and consider how they shape our work. So we're thinking about, and we're going to hear explicitly named and defined what storylines are. But we're also going to be thinking about how it relates to our literacy field and what connections we might have, the storylines that are glaring for us. The other thing we're going to be looking at is we want to understand what discretionary spaces are and how you and others might use them to promote educational improvement, how you might be able to use them to leverage the essential practices. These are powerful spaces that we want to be more intentional about. And then lastly, we're going to look a little bit more closely, and hopefully you have your devices open and you can get to the essentials. We did not print those out. We know you kind of carry them as your other little Bible or your important research that you can always refer to, but we also have access to those at literacyessentials.org. Shameless plug. You can always get them there, but we're going to use the organizational practices to begin authoring new storylines. And so we'll begin authoring them. And I think beginning to author them, we're thinking about, it's a beginning stage, like we're knowing and we're doing them, but it's what happens in the classroom, what happens when we're working with our colleagues that actually rewrites the narrative of what's happening in education. Okay, so, but we are going to get a chance to look closely at the organizational practices and try authoring some new storylines. Okay. So let's start. You have a note catcher in the center of your page, of your table, and if you're online, you have access to that note catcher as well. If someone can maybe put it in the chat. So it's always good for us to frame our thinking around the values that are at the center of our organizational practices. We're thinking about systems and how we support educators with the literacy essentials, with the math essentials. We always want to lean into our values. So let's just take a moment to read through, to revisit those values. And I want you to think about which values are particularly resonating with you today in connection or relationship to the work you're currently doing. Okay, so we'll do that first with our values. Let's just take a few minutes. Know that all these values are very important. Just giving ourselves a moment. Are there any that are really speaking loudly to you today? Let's take a moment to just share out at your table what were some of the values that were resonating with you, and just share at your table groups about why those particular values are resonating with you today in relation to the current work that you're doing. Okay, and then no, they could just type in the chat. If you're online, go ahead and type a few things in the chat.
Makes sense. So this is random. I'm also the school health coordinator for a region.
Making sure she didn't want to say something too long. Before I was like, yeah, I don't.
Maybe let's hear one or two in the room and maybe one from online. What values are resonating with you today and why? Okay.
Both Denise and I triple underlined it
triple underlined, yes.
It's the very first one, the very last part, never done,
Mm.
never done.
Yes, this is ongoing work. And-
Groundhog's Day.
Yeah. Yes, it's like, have we been here before?
Yeah, Groundhog's Day.
It feels like deja vu, yeah.
Well, when
So-
people say the pendulum always swings back, right?
Yeah.
Groundhog's Day, we visited a lot of them.
Yes, we are never done. This is ongoing work and the work gets deeper and deeper as we go. Thanks for sharing, Melissa. One more in the room? Values that are standing out to you?
So our table kind of looks at that powerful learning for children requires powerful learning for the adults.
Absolutely. Yeah, if we take on the mindset as adult learners that we have to engage in powerful learning and we want to see shift in practice in that learning, then we know that that will in turn impact our children as well. So those are definitely values we want to continue to live into. Anyone online? Yeah, Carrie?
So online, there was lots of comments kind of all over, but
Okay.
quite a few for bullet 2, talking about the equity and inclusion piece. And then also lifting just what this table did about the powerful learning for children requires powerful learning for educators.
Yeah, we want to make sure that there is equity, that there is access to high quality learning and instruction for our students, for all students. And even those that are in marginalized areas. And so today we're framing our thinking around these values. I also wanted us to take a quick look at our enabling conditions. I'm not sure if I can put it up here. The enabling conditions that live within our K-3 practices that were just recently updated in September last year, right? And we want to use this to frame our thinking because we are going to see some hard, we're going to have some hard conversations. And a lot of times in our work, we do have challenging, tough conversations. And so we always want to make sure that we're thinking along the lines of our values and the conditions that really make this work possible. Okay, so just take a moment and review the enabling conditions as well. And we know that all of these essential practices, the instructional practices, work in concert together. You'll see some similarities and some connections. To our values that are in the organizational practices. Culturally relevant, responsive, and sustaining. It's really standing out to me. Opportunities for children to see themselves in books, but also as mathematicians, you know, that they have healthy identities about what they're able to do. Positive relationships amongst all stakeholders. And that asset-based thinking, orientation towards our children. What are they doing? What are they able to do? Not just what they can't do. So we're gonna begin to launch our learning by reading a short article by Dr. Deborah Ball. And just want to give you a moment. Those are there on the table, or we'll make sure that link is in the chat for you online if you're virtual. And as you begin to read the article, I want you to think about and just annotate, prepare to have a discussion amongst your table group. What are some of the key points that are resonating with you? I'm gonna star those. And then you can mark a C next to connections to the essentials, where we're thinking specifically about the values that we just used to frame our work and those enabling conditions. Okay, so are there any connections to the essentials values and enabling conditions? And then what questions are surfacing for you after you read? It's a quick read, about 5 minutes or so. So I'll give you some time, and then those that are virtual, if you have your camera on now and you want to turn it off to do some reading silently, feel free to, or we can continue to look into your beautiful eyes.
You want to start working on getting the link,
Okay.
or try the QR. Okay, I did say working on getting it done.
The link is in the bottom of the slide.
It's in the notes.
Yes,
Got it.
yeah, in the slide.
Perfect.
Yeah, it's very good. Maybe drop it in. Partners, we talk about. Okay, go ahead.
So we started to value two throughout, and then among others. And then just the focus on you need to be child-centered and solution-oriented.
Yeah, back to the heart of our work and back to our why, right? That we're focused on teachers and students at the heart of our work. You mentioned essential, bullet 2 from the values. Say a little more about that, or?
Well, the exact.
Okay.
Well, like that collective responsibility piece and then inclusion of all families. And so it talked a lot about, discrepancies among, socioeconomic status, like brown children, et cetera. And so I felt like that went great.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing out. Let's take one more in the room. Another group. Okay.
One thing that stood out, we talked a little bit about was, there's no quick fix that erases, the unprecedented break with everyday schooling. So that kind of, goes to bullet 1 where it talks about meaningful change takes time.
Yeah, meaningful change takes time. It's not a quick fix. And a lot of times when we go into professional learning and we have a professional learning day, we do feel empowered leaving that space. But we have to keep in mind that this work is ongoing. Thanks for lifting that. Any online?
Random weird thought that just
Okay.
happened right now. When you leave professional development, do you feel like when you leave and you're like, yeah, I really nailed that, we're good? Or do you feel like we should be more like unsettled? Because like we're in the middle of it. I don't know.
Yeah.
I just thought of it, like, kind of mess.
Yeah, I think it's something to think about, definitely. I mean, because if you do start to feel like it's fixed, then those are things that make you go, there's milestones and goals that you hit.
Sometimes I feel like I've shifted the thinking in the room. Like
Yeah, I like
I've
that.
had them thinking about it more deeply in a different way, and that's when I feel like, okay, I did my job.
So it's kind
But
of
then you
space
can
for
move
both
to
of
the next
those.
thing, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, because your brain is open to maybe a different way of thinking about.
Okay. So
You
maybe
get
both
that
ways
shift in
are
how
okay for you.
Yes.
Depending where you're at in the process.
Yeah. I think we think the same thing when we're teaching our kids, right? We're thinking about, okay, what's the next step in learning, right? They're never done learning, but what did they get? Let's celebrate those accomplishments. Let's celebrate those goals. And we as educators, supporting educators, adult learners, we can think the same way about steps. What's the next step that we're taking, or what small chunk of goals that we accomplish in the first cycle of the year or the first part of the year. So you might leave knowing that, was there some shift that took place, and hearing back from the people in the room a lot of times gives you that feedback, when you're listening to those conversations. Okay.
So online, Michelle, I'm gonna say Mogenberg.
Okay.
She shares that she's long thought that we're taking this idea of educational reform from the wrong angle. Shared that maybe putting more focus on educational prep programs to be more deliberate in what new teachers are learning from the beginning. So sharing that piece out. And then Dana Browning shared that she didn't really get a chance in her group, but appreciates that in the article there's an explicit mention of a diverse cadre of paraprofessionals from the community that tie and integrate with all the stakeholders. So it makes it meaningful, and makes that very meaningful, and it's often overlooked in PD and training opportunities.
Yeah, diversity amongst those that are providing a professional learning. Is there, and is there a collective sense of responsibility for our students? Is there distributed leadership, amongst the professional learning that we're delivering? That is key. So in launching our learning about discretionary spaces, I thought this article would be good to anchor us in thinking about what stories are being told. Because a lot of times the stories that are being told in our field is what might bring some constraint to teachers in the work that they're doing. Is also the stories that are being told in our field that defines some of the work that they're doing. And so the video clip that we're getting ready to watch from Dr. Deborah and Dr. Maisie Gholson is really going to give us a good sense of knowing about three particular I guess, ways of thinking and approaching our learning. Storylines, we're gonna learn a little bit more about storylines, authoring, and discretionary spaces. So they'll go ahead and they'll frame the work for us. You'll get a strong understanding and definition of what these things are and how they impact the instruction that happens with our teachers and the learning that happens with our students. And this is from last year's Early Math Institute 2023.
These storylines, and the more we come to appreciate that we actually do have.
You want to go back to, I think, 9 minutes? 9:40. 9:40. Yep.
All right, so the next thing that we're going to do is to introduce 3 key terms and concepts that we're using throughout today's session. So there are 3 of them are on this slide, so I'll talk about them each briefly, but we'll be using them throughout the whole session. So the first is the notion of storylines, and I think we saw a few minutes ago that many of you encountered this idea with us in the past, but if you didn't, we promised that we would sort of completely sort of get us all up to speed on that. But storylines are ways that a term we use to talk about institutionalized ways of speaking and looking and listening and understanding about the world. And they both define how we perceive things around us, and they also constrain that. And that will become clear as we talk about the storylines that permeate our work with children, with mathematics, and in classrooms.
Could I give an example, a quick example?
Yeah.
So a current storyline is around learning loss, right? So the pandemic created learning loss, and now that's a discourse or a storyline that's running through that I'm sure all of you are familiar with, right? So how does that storyline constrain how you think about your work? How does it define your work? Got it?
So that goes right to the second idea of authoring. So authoring is the work we're doing to either reinforce or disrupt and change storylines. So for example, the learning loss discourse is one that you could be feeling kind of oppressed by and worried about, or it could be one where you're challenging yourself and those with whom you work to think differently about why is that discourse, sort of that storyline, sort of all about us right now, and are there other ways to think about it? The third idea has to do with discretionary spaces, and this is an idea that we'll talk more about, but it has to do with the fact that although we often think about our work as leaders, as coaches, as professional development people, as teachers, as very constrained by lots of things in the larger environment, and indeed they are, it's also the case that teaching and education of all kinds is filled with tons of discretion that we're enacting all of the time. And those discretionary spaces have a lot of power, because when we notice that we have them, we have the ability to act and to do things in those spaces that don't necessarily completely reproduce those same storylines. But until we see that we have that discretion, we're likely, especially in the current environment, to feel incredibly constrained, as though we have no agency and no power. And so this idea we'll try to open up by looking at examples and thinking, how can you use this idea to empower and provide agency to those who could actually work to change storylines? So a couple of things to say about storylines. Where do they come from? They come from the larger environments in which we work. They are part of the histories around the way we think about children, the way we think about race, the way we think about learning, the way we think about teaching. They're all around us, and so this image is supposed to show that they're all part of things that we've grown up with, that are part of what we've learned. We've learned ideas like that from the media. We've learned them from when we were students ourselves. There are things that we're carrying about, like what math is, that are part of things we've just grown into, and those are all about us, all around us. But the point here is that the districts and schools and classrooms where we work are really porous. And so they're not sort of shuttered off from those larger environments. Those storylines are seeping right inside of classrooms and districts and schools and our institutions. So that's the first point about storylines, where they are and what they're doing. To kind of parallel to that is that classrooms are very permeable. So those ideas that are around us in the environment, these storylines, can completely permeate classrooms. Like the learning loss example can be one that teachers are feeling very much sort of constrained by, worried about. That's because the larger messaging around learning loss seeps right into everyday practice and affects things like how a teacher might see a particular student, how a teacher might think about their curriculum. Classrooms are very, very permeable. And that takes me to the third idea about discretionary spaces and the power that educators have. So this image is intended to be a graphic to help make clearer what we're talking about. So on the left of the slide, what you see there is just a segment of a classroom lesson. You're not supposed to read it. It's just like every line is something that a teacher says, or a student is saying, or a student is doing. Sometimes it's not verbal. And in each of those spaces, this is about 1 minute of classroom activity. In each one of those spaces is a moment or a space where a teacher acts in a way that is not constrained by a policy or an administrator. An example might be a teacher begins a math discussion with a group of students. The teacher in this case might say, who would like to explain your thinking and just tell us how you're thinking and how you were first thinking about this problem. That's a very different bid than if the teacher said to the class, who can tell us the answer to that problem? And those two bids to open a classroom discussion aren't constrained by the school principal or by the curriculum or by a policy. They come from somewhere. They come from the teacher's own sort of habits. They could come from a decision that the teacher makes. And that's just that's like one moment or one space. And this thing shows you that in every one of these spaces throughout a minute of instruction, there are many, many, many spaces of discretion. Another one that might be illustrated is that as a teacher begins to work with a group of students, perhaps there are some students that are not seeming to be looking in the direction of the work, or they're maybe putting their heads down on their hands, or maybe they're not sitting up straight. A teacher might decide that he or she needs to stop at that moment and sort of say, like, we can't really go on until everyone is ready to listen and pause and wait. Or a teacher might decide to just move on through and continue to engage students in the work. And that has consequences for how students are experiencing the class. And that's another example of doing or not doing. And if you see here in 1 minute, those arrows pointing back to the classroom and to storylines are infiltrating the classroom all of the time. So teaching is just dense with these spaces of discretion, often of which we're not even aware. And we're acting in those spaces, or teachers are acting in those spaces by making judgments or interpretations or decisions, and sometimes those aren't even conscious. Sometimes they're just implicit and they're habits, they're things that we're not realizing we're doing, and yet they shape the classroom. You can take another example. Imagine 2 lessons from a curriculum, and if you saw 2 different teachers teaching that lesson, it would look different in 2 classrooms. Why is that? It's because a curriculum can't completely determine what someone is saying and doing with a group of students. And all of that space is discretionary, and it is in that space that there's power to affect those storylines, to change them. So we'll try to use that idea today.
Could I make 2 quick points? One,
you don't need to ask permission for that. You are my partner.
I'm just being polite for the audience's sake. But those storylines are the things that the teacher is manipulating and deciding what to do with. So the storylines come in, the teacher makes a set of decisions or enacts a set of habits that then render those discretionary spaces in particular ways. I just want to make sure you said that. I just want to highlight it. And then the other thing that I want to show, are you all a little overwhelmed by all of those arrows? The level, the amount, but also think about that as power. Because every time we enact a habit or make a decision. That's power to write a storyline in a particular way. So we can think about it as the overwhelming work that teachers do in classrooms, the overwhelming work that you do, and the kinds of discretionary spaces you have to navigate. You could think about that as overwhelming, or you could think about the power that you have in each of those decisions. I just want to highlight those two things.
It's not supposed to be a paralyzing idea. It's supposed to be an idea that empowers us to realize that we have the ability to make change. We're ready for some teamwork?
Ready for you?
All right. So I want you to take a moment to think about some of the storylines that are filling in your work, the professional learning system that you are currently connected to, whether it be at your ISD or at those that are here in the room. I'm going to ask you to take out the sticky notes in the box. And I want you to just think about Dr. Maisie Gholson gave an example of learning loss, you know, from the pandemic being a storyline that impedes the system, the current learning system. So it doesn't have to be specifically related to ELA, but it can be, because there are some storylines that are coming into our world that really help to either constrain teachers and make them feel overwhelmed, or they might be coming in to help define where the work should be going. But I want you to take a minute and think about some storylines, put one storyline per sticky note, and just kind of think yourself, as related to your work. Can you go to the next slide? When you think about the context of the work that you're currently doing, what storylines are mediating the goals of your current professional learning system? For those that are online, you can use the note catcher, but those in the room, I really want you to go ahead and jot one sticky note, one storyline per sticky note. What's in the media? What is the news telling us about our work? How is it infiltrating in the work that you do, supporting teachers, educators? Okay, we can go ahead and move into some table group sharing. And what I'd like for you to do for those in the room, each person share out the storylines that emerged that you were thinking about. And then you're gonna take a moment to sort them into common themes. You have some chart paper at the end of your table. As you share amongst your table group, what are some of the common storylines that you're seeing? And I want you to group those into themes. And then think about how might these storylines relate to specific essentials, whether it be organizational practices or instructional practices, okay? And then as you organize your sticky notes on the chart paper, you want to go ahead and label those common themes, and then we'll see what's emerging in our field, and we'll talk about that after we get that shared time and that work time, okay? What questions might you have about this portion of our work? Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and let you get started, and Mark is gonna give instructions to those online that are virtual in the breakout rooms. Got whiteboards. Ready to come back together. Give a few more seconds. For those that are online, we're going to invite someone from your groups to share out. You might want to put something in the chat as it relates to the storyline, maybe one storyline that that you all talked about. You might have had a couple of common themes, but we want to hear at least one from our virtual world, and we'll hear from some of the people in the room as well. All right.
Share now.
Not yet. I was giving some instructions to the people online. Okay.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
I wasn't gonna try. By the way, as I'm sharing, her Instagram account, as I was sharing.
Oh, yes, yeah. So there's a little.
But I told them.
I want to hang
Yeah,
your
sorry.
chart
No,
over
I'm
here.
gonna share and then I would post their.
Oh, sure, yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, let's get ready to share out. People online, and we'll start with people in the room, and hopefully you all can hear online as well. And we'll just move around the room. We'll start, whoever wants to start, it's fine with me.
All right.
Okay? Okay.
We're just kind of sharing one.
Yeah, share one thing that emerged, and then think about how it connects to either an organizational practice or an instructional practice, and how we might leverage that practice in order to author new storylines in the field. Okay.
Okay, that's a lot. Okay.
All right. Trying to remember that.
One thing that had, like, we had our most sticky notes in this area, and we kind of labeled it SOR, legislation and politics, because we have, that started with the impact of grade 3 in coaching, and then the whole, obviously, we know the argument right now, or all of the, media of SOR, science of reading, and the depth of knowledge that people have around science of reading, and how the confusion around, some of people, are so focused on just phonics and phonemic awareness, and that's all we need to do to teach reading, and the lack of understanding that, the essentials contain the science of reading, and that we need all of it to create literate, human beings. And so we felt like it obviously really represents all of the essentials, and just helping teachers, families, students realize that we need all of those essentials to be literate.
How many of you in the room also had science of reading as one of your buckets? One of your common themes. And it is that common theme, right, that can sometimes bring restraint to teachers or constraint to teachers, where they feel overwhelmed, or we can leverage our instructional practices in order to author new storylines. What's actually happening in the classroom? What kind of shifts are actually happening? Thanks for sharing this, team. Yeah, sure.
Okay, so we did have that, we actually had a little bit more, we added like dyslexia built to that one.
Yes, yes.
Dyslexia legislation.
Yeah.
So one of our biggies was, we just label it educators, but it's kind of, like people that are on daily sub permits, or not fully credentialed in where they're teaching, or you have somebody with 60 credit hours that's teaching a special ed classroom the whole year. So are unqualified, uncredentialed, I don't want to say low skill, but maybe people that haven't had like education courses or like actual mentoring in an educational setting previously. That is a big topic, including even administrators, or, building or otherwise, and kind of the same, lack of experience or expertise that they might have as well. Does that sound like I encompassed it?
Mhm.
And we just quickly connected those to organizational practice, 1 around leadership team, and 2 under the organizational climate. Actually, I could probably filter through many of these.
Yeah,
So
overlap.
that was where we came.
Yeah. And when we do have like the lack of certification, then you're definitely going to see some different discretionary spaces that are, that looks different from one classroom to the next, right? Because what they choose to do in the moment in instructional shift is going to matter because of, the training they may have had, or, the practices that they're familiar with or not familiar with. So thanks for
And
lifting
if
it.
any, like when you coach a new person into a classroom, especially like, as coaches, right, we notice like we can think of like 5 different ways to do like an and one onto something, and they're struggling to come up with one, but that's just the experience and the instinct and just being in there more.
Yeah.
And when you think about it, sometimes a whole building is like that. Like, we have a couple of our four social academy where there's one certified teacher in the whole building. So it's not even like they have somebody next door
To go to the collaborative.
or talk to.
And it goes back to, right, our values.
Yeah.
Right.
The equity piece there.
I would say connected to that too is that idea of teachers when they don't see themselves as readers, writers, mathematicians, scientists. So like, how am I gonna teach that? If
Right.
I myself
If I don't feel confident, right?
in that?
Mhm.
So I didn't quite know how to phrase that.
Did you have another theme that hasn't been mentioned yet from this group since we're over here? Mhm.
We actually mentioned a lot of the ones that they have mentioned, they kind of fall into those buckets. But we had one kind of an investment and change is kind of what we labeled that. And it was talking about compliance versus commitment. And to go along with that, just like the Jill and the science of reading, I think often, at least in our area right now, we are seeing, what do I need to do to be compliant with the law and just get through the day? I can't believe how many administrators and people, I just need to get through the day. We just need to get, already we're talking about, I just need to get to Thanksgiving break. Beginning of October.
Yeah.
I mean, we should still be in a honeymoon phase, right? And so really kind of thinking about number one in those organizational practices about, is your leadership team filled with people who are committed to change and understanding that change takes time and it's hard and we're going to be in that state of uncomfortable, but it's going to be worth it in the long run.
Mhm.
That kind of thinking.
Yeah. And then like referring back to Dr. Allison Fox Resnick's work, you know, that compliance piece is a part of how educators learning unfolds, right? So even though, but if we have a team that is committed to working through that messy trajectory, right, then we'll be able to see change in the future and know that it's coming, but there's a lot of different parts to it. What are the roles? What are the routines? What are the, you know, different events that are taking place in order to move them from that compliance to internalization? That very strong point. Yes, thanks for lifting that. Anyone, and then the group in the back, was there another theme that you may have had that hasn't been mentioned yet? Or someone online or a group that's online? Okay.
So online, a storyline that was brought up was around the lack of trust between the stakeholders. So referring specifically posted here, just admins, teachers, families, and then talking about that impact then has on learning.
Yeah, and a part of building collaborative relationships has to do with trust, transparency, everyone understanding their roles, and how their roles might impact the system, the professional learning system altogether. So yes, that trust piece is very important. Transparency, you know, all of those things come into play when we're talking about how we can move our learning forward and see teacher shift. Yeah. Okay. Well, it sounds as though, was there one more person?
Because I don't sit right now.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Is that the whole way here?
Yeah.
Stand.
Yeah. But was there anyone that wanted to, was there any more things that emerged, or did we hit all of the main ones?
Sorry,
Okay.
there was one more that showed up
Okay.
online.
And then we can.
Talking about investing in resources and things rather than investing in people, because expectations in people are low. So teachers are too overloaded, there's too much turnover, things like that. So that idea of where are we investing our time, energy, resources, you know, more into the resources and things rather than the people.
And so all these different themes, all these different narratives really enter the space of our classrooms, and teachers have to use them to decipher what to do in the moment when they're teaching. And along with, so it's not just the curriculum, it's not just the essentials, but it's those decisions that the teachers are making in the moment that really help to re-author or author new storylines across our field. There is more work that we can tap into and continue this discussion. I will invite you to look at the second portion of the video in another time. It is linked into our slide deck. But we are going to go ahead and wrap up. If Mark, you want to go to, let's see, let's just move to next, the final slide. Kind of hit that a little bit. Okay. So just kind of drawing some conclusions about the work around storylines, authoring, and discretionary spaces. Those broader storylines about math and literacy, children and learning, they move through the classrooms. And then authoring happens in discretionary spaces when teachers enact different habits or decisions. And Dr. Ball talked a lot about how sometimes those decisions that the teachers are making in a moment, they're not just based off of the curriculum, they're not just based off of the instructional practices, but it could even be some of the experiences they've had in their life, some of the things they're grappling with on a day-to-day basis. It could have been moments in school that were negative for them or moments in school that were positive for them. You know, so all of these different things help teachers to make decisions in the moment that actually help them to author what happens in those spaces. And then altogether, local storylines are produced by teaching or authoring that construct children in math and literacy. So when we're thinking about what our students are grasping, what they're learning, it's all produced by some of those storylines that are infiltrating our field and causing that shift to happen in our teaching. So altogether, there's a lot more. There's some other resources that are linked in the slide deck that you can revisit and in your handouts if you want to hear more about it. And Mark did develop a survey for us. This was one hot topic that was emerging across content areas, but we like to hear from you as we think about the rest of the year and the types of learning that you want to engage in or the topics that you might want to go deeper in. We're going to just give you a moment, a few minutes to take that survey and share with us some of the things that might be emerging in your line of work in your specific area that you might want to dig into this year.